I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my feature author of the month of November. He's award-winning author, no other than Mr. Gerald Everett Jones.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Welcome back, Mr. Gerald. And as usual, can you please again introduce yourself?
I am an author who has been working longer than probably most of our audience has been alive.
You're the legend.
I wrote business and technical books for many years, paying the rent. And when I turned to fiction, my book agent said, "Well, have a nice life." So I have my own publishing imprint, and I have published 14 novels, many of which have won awards, and one of which we will talk about today, which is one of the first ones that I published as a novel, Mr. Ballpoint.
Mr. Ballpoint. And again, Mr. Gerald, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge to the world. I hope more award-winning pieces like this to come. So what is the central theme of Mr. Ballpoint?
Well, when the iPhone was introduced, what was it? I don't quite remember the year. I think we're talking about the early 90s.
Yes.
There was something of a shopping riot because, this was just such a sensation and it was such a hot product. But many people might not know that ballpoint pen that they're holding in their hands caused an even bigger shopping riot in 1945 when it was introduced right after World War II. And one of the things that caused its popularity was the fact that there was nothing else to buy as a luxury item. It was the Christmas season. It was right after the war. The war had ended in the fall of 45. And so here were all these returning GIs. And of course, a lot of them thought that they were going to be coming back to desk jobs. They're going to be wearing white shirts, mostly men, right? So they're going to be wearing white shirts and they're going to be pushing pens. And back then, it was just all fountain pens, and fountain pens leaked. Now, I had in one of my day jobs, when I was involved in the computer industry, one of my employers was actually an heir to the family that had introduced the ballpoint pen in 1945. And I was something of a company historian, and I began to realize as I delved into the company history, not only what an unusual story it was, but interestingly enough, I interviewed one of the fellows who was the main character, Jim Reynolds, who was the younger of the father-son team. His father, Milton, was the one who marketed the ballpoint pen, the Reynolds Pen Company. And the odd thing was that when I was interviewing Jim, I said, "Well, this sounds like such an adventure. It's like Indiana Jones or something." And he laughed and he said, "No, I always thought it should be a musical." And I thought, that's really an odd thing to say. But then as I researched it some more, I realized what a comedy it was. Because Milton Reynolds was what back in the day they called a silver-tongued devil. He was a marketing man, a huckster. He could sell ice cubes to the Eskimos, all that kind of thing. And his son, Jim, who was the fellow that I knew, and Milton was passed away at that point. But his son, Jim, was a very mild-mannered, straight-shooting, honest kind of a guy. He could not tell a lie to help himself. And so it occurred to me that what us writers call an engine of comedy, it would be an engine of comedy if Milton would invent these outrageous schemes to market this brand new invention, and he would keep dragging Jim into the situation because Jim didn't want to fib about anything. But one of the things that happened with the ballpoint pen, Milton was not the inventor. The inventor was someone, Laszlo Biro, who was a Eastern European and had actually emigrated to, I believe it was Argentina during the war. But to this day in the UK, ballpoint pens are called Biros because of Laszlo Biro. Now, Milton Reynolds, there were no Biro pens in the United States. And he realized that if he could make them fast enough before this Christmas, that maybe he could corner the market. Now, the problem was that there was a patent on this Biro pen, which had to do with very gooey ink, just much like the pens today. It was kind of very gooey ink that dried when it came out of the tip. But Milton realized that he could get around the patent because nobody could patent the law of gravity. So
Yes.
if he made the ink thinner, then he could get around the patent. The problem was that these pens of his leaked very badly. But you see, fountain pens also leaked. That people just assumed that pens leaked, and so that was part of it. And then the other thing that happened that was really rather odd was that they thought they were going to have trouble manufacturing this pen in time, and it was like a crash program to, that they rented all this equipment and they moved it into an abandoned tennis court inside this warehouse, and they were really having trouble with it, and they kept testing these pens that didn't quite work. And Milton was testing one of the pens, and he had brought in a newspaper from outside. It had been raining, and he had it on the bar. He was having a drink at the time, had it on the bar, and he started writing with the pen, and the pen wrote on the wet newspaper. And he said to Jim, "It writes underwater."
Wow.
And Jim said, "Well, why would anybody want to do that?" And he says, "It doesn't make any difference. It's a great slogan. People will." The funny thing was that years and years later, I gave a presentation to was a pen collectors society here in Los Angeles, and I said, "Does anybody ever remember the introduction of the ballpoint pen, the Reynolds pen?" This hand goes up in the back, and this guy with silver hair, "That's the one that writes underwater." But the thing I think that is most interesting about this story is, besides the comedy of, I mean, there's just nutty things that they did. They autographed the belly of an alligator underwater,
Yes.
for example, as a publicity stunt. They had gorgeous models who wore scanty clothes, and they were, caressing pens. This was back before television. They could get away with that stuff. But one of the things that occurred to me early on is, right after World War II, it really was the beginning of what we would call today consumer society. The United States had been, for more than half a decade during the war, the United States had been a wartime manufacturer. It had been all about rations and shortages and women going to work in defense plants and the men going overseas, and a million people in the armed forces, both in Europe and in Japan. But when the war ended, returning GIs were, there was a GI Bill where the government would pay them to go to college. And also, there were the people coming back wanting their jobs back, and they wanted to be able, they wanted all the things that they had gone without. They wanted automobiles, they wanted refrigerators, they wanted washing machines, they wanted all the things that the people in Russia never got, that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even under Gorbachev, they never got any of that stuff, and so they were quite disappointed. But during the 1950s, the United States was just a booming consumer economy, and there were very few rules. There were no consumer protections. There was no consumer protection agency back then. There was no I don't think there was even a Food and Drug Administration or Federal Communications, Federal Trade Commission. There just were no rules. And so somebody like Milton, who was willing to break the rules if there were rules, and make them up if he didn't have them, one of the things that happened was that there were these established companies like Parker Pen Company,
Yes.
and Eversharp was a big company at the time. They also made lighters, and Eversharp ended up suing Milton Reynolds because they had licensed the patent. They had the right to make these pens. Well, Milton just turned around and countersued them, and for made up reasons. Okay, so it was really something that they called the Battle of the Pen Wars, and the Reynolds Company made, I believe it was $8 million in 6 weeks.
Wow.
Now that was back when you could probably add a zero to that in today's money,
Yes.
maybe more. So
Triple zero.
it was just an outstanding success. So I really feel as though, and the other thing that occurred to me it was actually after I wrote the book, was that this is in some ways an ideal story for young adults, because you've got a history of the United States that maybe is not taught that much in school. I mean, they know World War II happened, maybe, and the fact that the United States and its allies won, but the whole idea of the beginnings of the consumer society and what capitalism might have meant, and what startup entrepreneurship is, and initiative and invention and innovation. This story encapsulates all of that. And so, I often would tell my book publishers and my interview guests like you, interview hosts like you, that this is an ideal book report book, because
Yes.
you've got the history, you've got the invention, and technology too. Again, the iPhone changed society. Where everybody's walking around with one. Well, in 1945, the ballpoint pen changed society. Everybody was walking around with one within a few years. Even got to the point where they were disposable. There was this fellow, people probably don't even know the name, Baron von Bick, in
Yes.
Germany, invented the disposable Bic pen.
Yes.
the see-through case. And one of the things that the ballpoint pen did was it democratized letter writing and document creation. You didn't have to have necessarily a typist. Of course, typists. There were typists all through up until the time of computers. Some people remember typing, but typists or fountain pens tended to be expensive. You wouldn't say only white collar jobs could afford them, but it was typically somebody who, trained in penmanship, and they were careful about their writing, and yet, anybody who could walk into a dime store could buy a ballpoint pen eventually. And so, letters, postcards, that whole, it was the email of the day. Write Auntie a postcard from your vacation to Biloxi, Mississippi, and you just let them know that there are white sand beaches there, that kind of thing. So I had great fun doing this, and I just felt as though it was a story that could capture the imagination,
Definitely.
of young people.
Yes. So, Mr. Gerald, how does the novel reflect the entrepreneurial spirit of the post-war era?
Well, it has to do with starting something from nothing, if you
Yes.
will, a new product, what they call, and actually the Reynolds Pen Company is used as a case study. I believe it was at Harvard Business School, as a case study in product introduction. But in fact, Milton Reynolds was not a struggling businessman. He'd started two or three companies before that, and he'd been fairly successful with this printing company that he had. And he had been successful enough that he actually had owned a private plane back in the I think it was early 1930s. And he'd actually, you didn't need much of a pilot's license back then either. So he was flying this private plane.
You,
And he became so interested in flying that at the end of World War II, he bought a used bomber from the U.S. military. And he had it retrofitted. He had all the armor stripped off of it. And then he had new engines put on it. And he wanted to break Howard Hughes's round the world record. Now, Howard Hughes was the filmmaker, inventor, the founder of Hughes Aircraft, the fellow who owned Trans World Airlines at the time, but, something of a colorful character himself. But Hughes had the record of flying around the world in a twin engine plane. Now, to do that back then, you actually had to make at least 4 stops because you had to refuel. you couldn't make it around the world, on one tank of gas. So, but Reynolds, he didn't have the nerve to fly that plane himself. I don't think he would have been able to, but he hired Chuck Odom, who was a decorated World War II fighter pilot. So that was the pilot of the plane. And they actually did end up breaking, by just a few hours, Howard Hughes' round the world record. So there is we begin the book by Milton and Jim both waiting very nervously outside President Harry Truman's office. And Milton thinks that he's going to be decorated for this wonderful achievement of flying around the world. Well, spoiler alert, and I won't give you the whole story, but it turns out that Truman had reason to be upset about his pen.
Spoiler. So, what motivated Jim Reynolds to challenge or support his father's vision?
Well, Jim inherited the business, and actually, by that time, they had gotten out of the pen business because, larger, more successful companies had started making their ballpoint pens, Parker and Eversharp, Waterman, some of the others. And Milton saw that, he couldn't expand fast enough to compete with them. So what he did was he sold the rights. He sold the rights to the pen. So to this day, if you go traveling in France, you can buy a Reynolds pen. Now they just simply bought the name. But Reynolds pens are popular in France and in Italy. No, not Italy. I'm sorry. They're in France and in India. You can buy a Reynolds pen in India. So, and again, these have nothing to do with the Milton Reynolds Company. It's just because it was a popular brand once upon a time, and the name stuck. So he got out of the pen business, and he sold the printing business to Jim, and Jim ran it as a very successful, quiet company for many years, and their business was selling printing equipment to retail stores to make signs, to make product signs. So it was a very unromantic, if you will, unsexy business. But it was a very solid company, and he ran it like an honest guy, and he lived a long life with a big family, and he was very much a prince among men. He was very widely admired in the business community, and he never did have his father's reputation for being a double dealer, if you will.
Yes. So, Mr. Gerald, this will be a true to life or it's fiction?
Well, it is fictionalized because
Fictionalized.
shall we say, entertainment purposes.
Yes.
I did work with the Reynolds family. I mean, that's where I got a lot of my research also.
Yes.
Is, I had access to some of the family history files, and also to some of the stories that they would tell about him. So I did have their permission to do the book, and interestingly, out here in Hollywood, um, I had a short career as a screenwriter.
Yes.
And this book was actually a screenplay before it was a book. As they say, it had made it around town a few times. But when I went to writing novels, I did adapt several of my scripts. Not, I would say maybe 3 of my scripts turned into novels, and the other 11 are stories that I wrote from a blank page, if you will.
So, Mr. Gerald, what challenges that Reynolds family face in their business venture?
Well, I would say that living down Milton's reputation was a challenge. Uh, People knew, you see, when Jim began to build back the printing company in the 1950s, the Reynolds name was still very much on people's minds, and they recognized the pen as being something of a flash in the pan, something that was possibly unreliable, something that it was really just a collector's item at that point, because I mean they still are. I mean there aren't very
Yes.
many Reynolds pens around, and so I think um, correcting that impression was an important task of Jim's in the early days of taking over that company. Uh, but then again, I think also the printing company had a very solid customer base. They sold to all of the big retailers. And so those were, even back, the introduction of the ballpoint pen, it was first sold at Gimbels department store in Manhattan. And Gimbels had been a client of the printing company. It was a whole reason that Milton was able to get in there and convince Fred Gimbel to carry this pen at the last minute, right before Christmas. So um, it was something of a mixed bag, I will say, and because I think also the salesmen of the printing company, the ones who went ahead with building the reputation back, I think that they were fond of telling Milton Reynolds stories. That made good for good. Two martinis at lunch conversation. Back in the days when people did that, and we realized it wasn't a health threat. You could have your Camel cigarette and your 2 martinis, and nobody really worried about it back then. That was the culture, because
Yes.
I mean, so many GIs smoked in the service. I mean, that's what you did when you were trying to wait for things to happen. Is the military got more tobacco assigned to it than the consumers did. It was hard to buy tobacco
Yes.
because it was given to the troops as or troops were allowed to obtain it because it was something that did seem to help morale. And uh, I mean, I know that my grandfather um, picked up the habit of smoking in World War One. It was just something everybody did, and so times have changed certainly. Now we've got the addiction of the iPhone, of course.
Yes. I think nowadays iPhone is the most addicted thing.
Yes,
S-
try to pry that away from somebody, right?
Yes. Where's my cell phone? My day is not is not complete without my cell phone. So, Mr. Gerald, how did you resolve the central conflict in the Mr. Ballpoint?
Well, trying to decide how to end the book was a bit of a challenge, because to make it fiction it was necessary to rewrite history a bit
Yes.
because you had, I made the rivalry between Jim and his father somewhat more bitter than it actually was. In fact, Jim and Milton, it's not that they didn't get along or that they did get along. They really didn't work together that much. Jim had been what today you would call a latchkey child. That is that when he was growing up, he was sent to private school, and then he was very active in the Boy Scouts, but he would go to long summer camp and those kinds of things. But all this time, Milton and his wife were flying around the world, visiting customers. I mean, they were globe at that point because of the riches from the ballpoint pen. They were globetrotters. They I guess you'd call them semi-retired. But after his wife died, Milton retired to Mexico, and he bought a hacienda, and the family called it the Milton Hilton.
Yes.
It was palatial.
That
By all,
awesome.
I don't know whether it exists anymore, but it was in the outlying part of Mexico City. So he
Yes.
lived like a el patron in his older years.
So, Mr. Gerald, what lessons did you learn in writing Mr. Ballpoint?
Well, in translating a movie script to a novel, one of the things that you begin to realize, and it should be no surprise, is that you've got to put everything on the page that the camera would see or that the actors would feel. You just begin to realize all the things. A movie script is a blueprint. It's no more of a house than a drawing on a piece of paper. It is a floor plan. So you really have to paint a picture, and that does, I think, also. One of the things I think that we find now with we're talking about modern inventions, talk about streaming, for example. With streaming, you can if you translate a book to a streaming series, you may have 6 to 13, 14 episodes in a season. Okay. That allows you to do an episode for maybe every chapter or every 2 chapters. So the amount of air that you can breathe, the amount of room that you have, the amount of character development that you have in a streaming series is more like the pace of a novel. When you have a feature film, you've got to compress everything. And, just more than 2 hours and people start wiggling in their seats. That's why they used to have intermissions. And I think that also when you compress it, I mean, I recall reading there was an Ann Tyler novel, Saint Maybe, which one of my favorite novels, and I recall recently seeing the movie that had been adapted from it. Okay, and it was a 2-hour, I believe it was a Hallmark movie, and I was struck by the fact that because they had compressed it, they compressed it to the extent that all of the crises that had happened in the family seemed to they didn't leave any of the bad things that happened out. Okay, it was from one crisis to another, one heartache, one heartbreak, one calamity, one sickness, one betrayal, all this back to back. And the thing was that in the novel, yes, there were milestones in these people's life, but there was a lot of stuff that happened in between. So when you compress it, it was a much sadder experience. Because in the novel, people coped with what happened. They comforted each other. They debated it. They discussed it. They lived through it, and you could see how they lived through it. But in the movie, it was just like oh my God, these poor people. So there is a difference. There really is a difference.
Big difference. To sum up our discussion, Mr. Gerald, what does Mr. Ballpoint reveal about the consumer culture of the 1940s?
Well, I think one of the things it reveals is why we have rules, why we have law, um, why we have rules against monopolies and oligarchies. One company dominating an entire industry, even though we have Google and Apple and all that. I mean, and one might wonder whether they did break up AT&T years ago, and maybe people don't remember that. And IBM was so afraid they were going to break them up that they let Bill Gates have the PC. It's
Yes.
like we don't need that might look like we own everything, so why don't you take the PC? So yes, I think that the need for, if you will, the only entity that is big enough to stand up against big business when there is unfairness is the government. And we're talking about the largest and the most active economy in the world. The idea that our government would be anything but large is very unrealistic. You've got to have some, I mean, I don't know that even any single state, maybe the state of California, because it's as big as Japan or bigger in terms of its economy. Maybe a prosperous state like California or Texas could stand up against a big corporation, but I mean, Rhode Island couldn't do that. you know, so you know, and again, pollution regulation and customer and consumer safety, and there was just a recall on organic carrots of all things. Nice healthy food. It's like it's supposed to have E. coli bacteria. Well, if somebody hadn't flagged that as an inspector, then that product would still be on the market. People getting sick, and the grocery store would say, well, we can't really guarantee everything is going to be just perfect. So I would say yes, there are those lessons learned, that there is a reason. There's excitement in entrepreneurship, starting something from nothing, breaking the rules, changing people's perceptions about, oh, well, no, you don't have to have actually, for a while in the beginning of the Reynolds Pen Company, the banks got upset about the ballpoints, and they said you must sign a check with a fountain pen. Because they were afraid the ink could smear, or they had all these worries that these new devices, nobody really knew what the new devices would do. So yes, there was that kind of backlash, and there is with anything new. There's going to be a debate about should we, shouldn't we? What can this be used? Can this be abused? And with something as innocent as a ballpoint pen, it might not seem like it would be that big a deal, but again, it was the sensation of its day for several years.
Definitely. Totally agree, Mr. Gerald. And again, thank you so much for sharing your talents and award-winning piece, Mr. Ballpoint. And can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
GeraldEverettJones.com is the website, and you can even find review copies of ebooks there at no charge. And I have a Substack blog, Thinking About Thinking. So if you like to think about your thoughts,
Yes.
please join me there.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Gerald Everett Jones, because if you support him, more award winning piece like this. Looking forward for more, Mr. Gerald. And again, thank you so much for your time.
We'll do it again. Thank you, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.